Welcome to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi everyone, this is Chris Quarto and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. So when was the last time that you reminisced about some positive event that happened in childhood or high school? Or maybe something that's happened more recently? You know, I'm thinking about a favorite vacation spot where my wife and I like to vacation in Michigan. And it's in a quiet place in a cottage on a lake. And every time I think about that, it brings about really good feelings. And you know, even studies have shown that reminiscing can enhance mental health. There was a study that was done several years ago where researchers asked participants to think about a nostalgic event and to write about it. And they looked at the number of optimistic words that were included in the responses, and they compared those responses to a control group who were asked to think about something from the past, but it was just sort of like an ordinary event. And those nostalgic responses contained a significantly higher proportion of optimistic expressions than the ordinary stories. So engaging in this kind of thing can help with optimism. Now, the other study that I read about pertaining to this had to do with how thinking about events from the past stimulates areas of the brain that are usually associated with daydreaming. And typically, you think about, well, if you're daydreaming, that isn't going to help you on things that you want to get done, on tasks. Well, in this particular study, it showed that engaging in regular reminiscing can actually enhance problem solving on certain types of complex problem solving tasks. So I guess the thing that I've seen is recommended is to try to engage in reminiscing about 2 to 3 times a week. And my challenge for you today is to try to think of one event that's happened in your past, a positive event, that can kind of be your go-to memory. And to take a little bit of time to experience the positive feelings associated with that memory, and to add a couple of more of those memories over the course of the next several days, and spend some time just kind of experiencing those positive emotions that go along with that. So that's my mental health tip for the day. Okay, let's get to today's podcast interview with Jef Gazley. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm joined today by Jef Gazley, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed professional counselor, alcohol and drug counselor, and distance credentialed counselor. And Jef, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Hey, if you wouldn't mind, tell the Make a Mental Note taking audience a little bit about who you are and what you do for a living.
So I've been a psychotherapist for 40 years, which seems amazing at this point.
Time flies.
And I have a psychology and a history degree and a teaching degree in both of them. And that's part of what I do with my psychology, is I really look at it as in terms of a person's history, and that degree has helped me a lot in my work.
Okay. So what is it that made you decide to go into this field? I mean, you could have done a lot of different things, but you chose the helping profession, counseling in particular, and what made you decide to pursue that field, Jef?
So a couple of reasons. I had always wanted to be a doc of some sort. I just kind of had that calling, and then I had the credentials. My family was crazy. And, you have to have that to be able to get into the club.
Okay.
So my dad was alcoholic, and my mother was a borderline personality disorder. So
okay.
I got in easy.
Okay. Full-fledged member.
You bet. I wanted to kind of figure out why the hell things were happening the way they were.
Sure.
And the mind always fascinated me. And early part of my career, I struggled with codependence and trying to save the little ones. And so once I got that taken care of, then I could actually really be of help.
Sure. Okay. Well, one of the things is part of your credentials, and I noted this in the beginning, was the distance credentialed counselor, which some of the listeners may not be familiar with that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
So distance counseling is touted as something that is rather new, late 1990s. And in some ways it is. In other words, the technological revolution allowed us to reach out to people either by telephone or computer, chat, email, video counseling, in a way that so that somebody didn't have to actually come to the office.
Yeah.
But I didn't look at it as terribly new because one of the things that I did in my career is to try to work with almost all populations. And so when I was going to school, I worked in suicide hotlines.
Sure.
And that essentially is distance counseling.
Yes.
Somebody calls in, they're in trouble, you go ahead and try to talk them down and get them to the right place.
And, you know, there are obviously critics out there, and I'm sure you've talked to people who are skeptical about the distance counseling area. And what's your take on that, or how do you respond to people who say, oh, that's just not a good thing to do because you can't have that well, I guess you can have the face-to-face nowadays, but it's just not the same as being in the same room physically with a person. How do you talk to people about those types of criticisms? How do you respond?
Basically what I say, I started Ask the Internet Therapist in 1997. And at that time, the video counseling wasn't great. That made it more difficult. There's no doubt about it. But because of my background with suicide hotlines, I saw the benefit of that. Now, I don't look personally at online counseling as the be-all of all counseling. I think that what has to happen is you figure out what a particular person needs, and you tailor it for them. And there are some things that you can do and some things you can't. So if I have somebody come to see me face-to-face and it looks like they need medication, I can't do the medication. I'm not a psychiatrist. And if we use the same argument, I shouldn't even see him because I can only do so much. What I think I can do with online counseling is I can do really good triage.
All right.
And I can refer when necessary. And when there are present-day issues, especially, we can often do that over the phone or with video. Do I miss some of the cues that I like to see? That would be at times, and if I feel like I'm missing those, then I'm going to refer them to a face-to-face person.
Okay.
So that's kind of the way that I would look at it. The other thing, Chris, that's kind of interesting is part of my background is as a hypnotherapist. And I got into energy psychology very, very early.
Okay.
So I do, in my private practice, face-to-face, I do a lot of body work. And I can't do that body work or the hypnotherapy online.
Right.
So I just don't use it for that. I use it in my face-to-face, and I use more cognitive therapy and triage in online.
I would guess that you've been doing this for quite a long time, and that over the years that you've been able to figure out which types of clients that distance counseling might work better with and which ones may not work quite as well with. Have you found like there are certain groups of clients, either personality types or certain types of problems or disorders, that it seems like, this is actually a pretty good approach, but, with these types, not quite as much?
Absolutely. So we don't treat people with psychosis over the phone.
All right.
It would be inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I might not know that at the beginning,
Right.
so that might be triage and referral at that point. In general, a great online client is highly verbal,
Mm-hmm.
has decent to good technological skills, is able to craft a sentence in a very clear way,
Uh-huh.
does not have a lot of characterological issues, borderline issues, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And very often the highly mobile person.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of my clients have been in Cirque du Soleil.
Huh.
How can they get real therapy if they're on the road all the time? That's perfect for online counseling.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the people who have been in Iraq or Afghanistan and are either with the service or auxiliary people,
Mm-hmm.
they often reach out by phone or by computer, and we do a good job with them.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like one of the advantages of distance counseling is that it provides more flexibility for clients.
It's cheaper. It's a lot more flexibility. There's an element of disinhibition that tends to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that can work for you positive and negatively.
Okay.
But the example that I usually give is earlier in my career, I headed up an alcohol and drug program.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of court-ordered clients, and it was like pulling teeth in a group.
Yes.
And in Arizona, you get terrific thunderstorms.
Uh-huh.
And during a group, we had one, and it knocked out all the power so that you couldn't see anyone.
Interesting.
And all of a sudden, the conversation got deep and quick and dynamic.
Is that right?
And it was the best damn group we ever had. So that's kind of what you look for. Now, having somebody shuck and jive and not give you accurate information, that is also possible, given that you can't see them unless you're doing video. But that's also a possibility face-to-face. You just kind of get a feel whether somebody's on the level or not.
You almost have to learn how to use your other senses, don't you, in ways that may not be used or used in the same way, I guess, if you were working with a person in person. And I guess that would be, I guess, just if you look at what people have to do anyway in learning how to do this craft and how to do this stuff, that you just have to kind of learn by doing, and that might be, learning how to do things differently as a distance counselor as opposed to in person.
There were two things I think that really helped me with that. The first is more cognitive in nature. I did about a 3-year stint in graduate school doing intake at a psych hospital.
All right.
And so I'd have an hour to assess, and if I was wrong, I would hear about it. So it allowed me to really diagnose very, very quickly,
all right.
And that was helpful. The other thing is a lot of my type of work is very, very intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
So on the Myers-Briggs, I'm about 99 on intuitive, which means I won't pay attention to what somebody's wearing. I won't get that info, but I will get the more intuitive side. The other thing about online counseling I think that's interesting is I worked for about 4 years with a blind counselor.
Huh.
And she was magnificent.
Uh-huh.
She was really, really good, and she didn't have any visual cues at all.
Mm-hmm.
The person could have been sneering at her as she talked, and she'd pick it up if the tone didn't seem right.
Interesting.
So that's kind of what I would look at. It's certainly different. There's no question about it. I think it takes a while to get used to. There are some modes of online counseling that I'm not really pleased with.
All right.
The most recent is texting.
Okay.
I think it's really an inadequate way to have a conversation. It's way too limited, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is chat is not my favorite.
All right.
But email and especially audiovisual, I think, are really, really helpful. And telephone I've been used to for a long time.
Sure. And I think that, for me, just kind of a novice in this area, just kind of looking at the video counseling, it makes the most sense to me because that's the closest to what we're used to doing just in the traditional, face-to-face counseling in a therapy room. And I think that there's actually, I was looking at some of the research recently, I guess it's come out in the past 5, 6, 7 years or so, that's showing more evidence for the effectiveness of, not only video counseling, but other forms of distance-based counseling too.
It has some good evidence behind it, and it's becoming more and more accepted, especially in Arizona. We have vast rural areas in the northern part of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And very early on, the health department set up telemedicine.
All right.
For people that really couldn't get off the reservation easily. And they've had very good success with that. And they even monitor medication, the psychiatrists, that way.
Yeah, we're starting to see that in Tennessee too, in terms of reaching people in the rural areas. It's exciting to see what's happening now. I think it's long overdue.
I do as well. We probably wouldn't have gotten into it unless video was a possibility.
Right.
When we started it, I was having a lot of mobile clients. They'd kind of come in as winter visitors and would go away, and we'd both be frustrated because we'd be in the middle of therapy,
right,
and wanted to continue. And I saw NetMeeting, a Microsoft program, quite a while ago, and we started to use that. But so that was really the impetus for us getting into that particular area.
Yeah, that sounds great. Now, I think that there might be some practitioners listening to this podcast and wondering, well, is this reimbursable by insurance? And I'm not sure if you do any of that in your practice, Jef, but are you aware whether or not insurance companies are reimbursing practitioners for distance-based counseling?
Yes. Basically, one of the reasons we got into this is there was a revolution in mental health, and it was the managed health insurance routine. Mm-hmm. And essentially what that did is, in my opinion, is they changed the parameters and basically said, you can succeed in 4.5 sessions, and anyone who doesn't is doing something wrong.
Right.
And that was cost-oriented.
Sure.
They cut in half all the people's sessions in terms of money.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get away from that and go back to the old model of somebody came and if they thought they needed help, they paid for it.
Right.
And they were done when they decided they were done. So we particularly did not accept and still do not accept insurance for online.
Okay.
It's actually just cash for session. Mm-hmm. But there are some EAP programs in Canada that are paying for distance counseling.
All right.
None in the U.S. that I know of at this time.
Okay. All right.
I think eventually they will.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was wondering, as I was listening to you talk about, the different types of clients that you see, do you find that the issues that are discussed in a distance counseling format are different than issues that are discussed in a face-to-face typical, therapy type of context. Do you find that there are any differences in that way, or are they pretty much the same?
They're pretty much the same. Most people come in because their relationships are not running well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that isn't always the case. Lots of times people have, different psychiatric problems that are more chemical in origin, and they're just having symptoms that they're not pleased with. But, most people come in because their relationships are not running real well.
Mm-hmm.
And same, rather in distance or face-to-face.
Is there a difference in how you would go about helping a person with a relationship problem using the distance counseling format as opposed to in person?
The pressure that I feel, and again, it's because of my background with intake and with history, is I want to get a complete social history before I begin.
All right.
And at times, people who come online are really interested in getting answers right away and staying in the more present mode.
Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, I don't want to work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So I will talk with them and really elicit enough of a history so that I'm not working totally in the dark.
Right.
There are some other therapists who are on the site that are much more present-day cognitive therapists that are comfortable with that. There are definitely different styles.
Jef, for the graduate students that are listening to this podcast episode, could you say a little bit about why obtaining a social history is so important?
So the thing that I'd look at, and I don't bill myself as a counselor, I bill myself as a psychotherapist.
Okay.
Because I think that most issues other than chemistry are really rooted in the early life of the individual.
Uh-huh.
But the thing that I'd look at with social history is, let's say I have somebody come in and they're depressed. Okay, so I've got to decide how much is that chemically based and how much is it emotionally based or situationally based, or do they have a thyroid problem?
Yeah.
And if I can't assess that correctly, I'm going to get lousy piecemeal results. And so getting a really clear picture of what's happening throughout a person's life and their parents and grandparents fills that picture for me. And it really determines what kind of therapy I'm going to use.
It really provides the context, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Now, how about when you're working with people online? I think we talked a little bit about this, and I'm almost interested in hearing what you have to say about the email, because you had mentioned that as something that you feel comfortable with too. When you get into the whole issue of trying to identify a client's feelings and try to figure out, okay, how is the client feeling? How do you do that by reading text? I mean, how does that work?
People tend to, they do diary type stuff.
All right.
And in a diary, you might say things a lot more directly than you would regularly.
Uh-huh.
We often censor ourselves in face-to-face. And I see less of that with email. The other thing is when somebody's writing an email, they're writing it from their logical, objective side for the most part.
Right.
A lot of the work that I do because of dealing with trauma is the idea of adult and child that I think we both are. So they're writing me an email from their adult position pretty objectively about what their child is feeling.
Right.
And so I can get a really nice picture because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And what I ask them to do is to go on at length and to tell me, how this issue started. I also want to know, exactly what's happening with the family. And so I'll ask a lot of questions in my emails to draw that out.
And I suppose that, we were talking about how this is a real art or a craft, that as you do this more and more, you can start to empathize. You can almost identify at more of a feeling level, even though they're not directly saying this, that you can empathize and perhaps reflect that back to them, how they might be feeling based on what they're writing in text.
Yes, exactly. It's, the other thing that I noticed with it, I had never really considered writing. But as I was doing the first couple of years with online counseling, I would have to write a lot more because almost all of it was email at that point. And now it's almost all video.
Uh-huh.
So it's changed over the years. But what it allowed me to do was really sit back and think about what's my philosophy of change, and how do I think people work, and why do they work, and
Mm-hmm.
and explaining it in that way. And so I think it made me a much more thoughtful and complete therapist because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something I didn't consider would happen at all.
That's interesting. Well, so you work with these clients, and they make an appointment to talk to you or to have these sessions with you. What's the recipe for success for online counseling? I mean, you have a person that comes in with this problem, and eventually they get the help that they need. Is there anything in particular that you do to get them from that point A to point B to help them experience therapeutic success?
It's really no difference between my face-to-face practice. And my face-to-face is 80% of what I do, and online's about 20.
All right.
Because I'm mostly now administering other therapists who are on the site.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at it more as just how you dispense counseling, how you engage in it.
Yeah.
And if the goal is still the same, what I want to do is really understand where the client is coming from, what is the issue, what's the origin of the issue, to align myself with that client so that they know that I care, and for me, establish a partnership in their health care to move them forward.
Mm-hmm.
And depending upon the particular situation, different techniques would be used, and also are they in my office or outside of my office. There are things that I can do now with the body that I cannot do online.
I see. Is it more difficult to maintain a working alliance throughout the course of therapy when you're doing distance counseling, Jef?
I think that in general, the clients, for the most part, online tend to be a bit more crisis-oriented,
Mm-hmm.
just need a little bit of info and a little bit of support, and then they'll move on, compared to the face-to-face clients. But that is not universal. There are some clients that I have had, and some of the affiliates on Ask the Internet Therapist, that have stayed for 6 months or more.
Right.
But very often we have people that do 1 to 5 sessions and then they move on.
I see. So what are the special challenges in working with clients in a distance format?
So for me, the real difficulty is some of the newer stuff that I got into. And so I'm a NET practitioner, neuro-emotional technique, which is an energy psychology technique based on Eastern medicine.
All right.
And I did a lot of training in acupuncture and acupressure and that sort of a thing. And so I can scan the body by muscle checking certain areas, and I can't do that online. So that's probably the major issue, because personally I feel that most trauma resides in the back part of the brain. So if you have the prefrontal cortex, which is the conscious part of the brain, that's 8 to 15% of what we've got. So the limbic system and the medulla make up the subconscious, which is 85. I've got to find some way to get in there. And for years I did hypnosis, but that was more cumbersome. EMDR is helpful, but again, I have to have the person here. And energy psychology I find by far the most effective and versatile, but again, I have to have the body here.
There may be some people who are listening to this podcast that are wondering about some additional challenges, and you've mentioned that many of the folks who you work with are crisis or have crisis types of issues. How do you ensure their best interest? I mean, if you're working with them from a distance and they're in crisis, they're suicidal, how do you work with that? I mean, I know that this kind of goes back to the suicide crisis lines, I know, but is that sort of the same way that you work with people now in the distance counseling area?
Up to a point, Chris. I'm comfortable dealing with suicidal clients online because of my past experience, but because of some of the guidelines for distance counseling, we decided very early on we would not work with suicidal clients.
All right.
We would not work with psychotic clients, and we would not work with people under 18 unless we've got a notarized release from their parents, which essentially knocks that whole population out.
Right.
Do I think it should be that way? I do with psychotic people. Not with the other two groups, but because of possible litigation, we play it safe with that. What we have had people who we've taken on, and then they let us know that they're suicidal. And what we do is give them the suicide hotline. There was one person who we felt was really kind of just gaming and not really suicidal, but we called the police in their town to let them know the information we had.
All right.
So you would do the same thing, again, that you would do face-to-face.
Right.
You know, I mean, somebody could come in and say they're suicidal and then walk out the door real fast.
Right.
What you going to do?
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
So you do due diligence with any kind of therapy that you do, and we have them sign, copious things that say, nope, we're not suicidal, we're not psychotic, we, are over 18, and we give them the suicide hotline right on the site.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, Jef, the last part of the interview is called Make a Mental Note, and it's something that you feel is important for the audience to make a mental note of, and just in terms of helping them, mental wellness, those types of things. Are there any tips or words of wisdom that you have for the audience that might help them?
So one of the things that I would look at is there are commonalities that I've seen over the years that almost all clients share, no matter what the main issue is. I think that we live in a very perfectionistic, hard-driving, neurotic society. And because of that, almost everyone I see has self-esteem issues, they have abandonment issues, and they have perfectionistic issues.
All right.
And so a big part of my therapy is to try to impart that no one's ever going to get perfect, that most of the time people are reacting rather than being nasty and horrible because they're nasty and horrible.
Yeah.
They usually feel attacked in some sort of a way. And if you pull back and realize that, then your life becomes easier all the way around.
Yeah. A lot of that involves, I guess, self-awareness and also what kind of assumptions do you make about people in those relationships like you were talking about earlier. So, yeah, that makes total sense. I imagine that there are some people who are listening to this podcast who might be interested in doing distance counseling themselves, but it's just not a matter of turning on your computer and turning on Skype and talking to somebody. There are training standards. I heard you mention those, that the standards of the field, and also just training opportunities that are available to people. Can you make mention of any of those types of opportunities that might be out there for people, Jef?
Sure, be happy to. The main program that really teaches distance therapy is a Ready Minds program that's connected with MBCC.
All right.
And they do workshops on distance counseling. They'll explain it all to you. They'll give you some experiential opportunities for the different types of therapy.
All right.
That would be helpful. The other thing is there are a number of online therapy books at this point. I'm trying to remember the particular authors with that, and it's been a while, so I can't remember. But what I would do is I just put online counseling in Amazon, and about 3 or 4 books will pop up. That'll give you a nice overview.
Okay. And I was going to ask you too, if a person wanted to do counseling with you and they lived in Tennessee, you in Arizona, is that possible, or how does that work?
So at the present time, and it's always a shifting field, there are no restrictions for most states with master-level therapists.
All right.
There is in California, and there is in Colorado. Both of them, you have to see somebody within the state.
Okay.
But no other policy has been formulated. And so right now, you can do therapy worldwide.
Okay.
The way that I consider it is the same way I consider winter visitors coming to Arizona. So I have somebody from Minnesota, they want treatment, they're here, I see them for a month and they go back to Minnesota. The therapy was here.
Right.
If they call me from Minnesota, they have come to my house.
All right.
And so I will do the therapy, and I consider that here. Now, that's still in flux. A lot of people think that the therapy is wherever the client is. There are some people that think the therapy is somewhere in the ether between the two places.
All right.
But if they call my office, I'll talk with them.
Yeah. Boy, there are certainly a lot of issues to be ironed out, aren't there?
Yeah, it's a real shifting field, and it's been unformulated for 15 years.
Yeah, that's amazing.
You know, it's starting to come down, but and the technology in every area has outstripped the basic rules.
Yeah.
It's moving too quickly.
Well, Jef, if a person is interested in seeking you out for counseling, how could they get a hold of you?
So what they could do is they could go to asktheinternettherapist.com.
All right.
And they could certainly go ahead and set up an appointment either with me. At the present time, all I'm doing is email and allowing the other therapists online to grab most of the clients. But if they call me directly at 866-998-0560 and want therapy in any other mode, I'd be willing to make an exception, but I don't publicize it at this point.
Sure.
Have another website that's add-care.com that's really interesting. One of the things that I've gotten into in the last 10 years is homeopathy, and have developed a line of natural supplements that we actually went over to the MMN clinic and went head-to-head against Adderall and beat them on their own turf.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay.
Really fun stuff.
Okay, well, we'll put all this information in the show notes, so if anybody wants to get a hold of you, they know how to do that. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. This is really fascinating stuff, and I'm sure a lot of people will appreciate listening to this.
It's fun doing it, Chris. Take care.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I appreciate Jef coming on to the podcast today to talk about distance counseling. And in terms of my mental notes takeaway, distance counseling, it's an alternate method of providing counseling services to clients. Some therapists don't want to provide those types of services, and some clients don't want services provided that way. But you know what? Clients who require flexible scheduling of counseling sessions, because they're traveling or there are time constraints, they really appreciate distance counseling. And also, clients that can't access in-person counseling because they might live 100 miles away from a mental health center, they also benefit from these services. Clients that seem to be most appropriate for distance counseling are those with good verbal skills and technological skills, and like Jef said, clients that don't have serious problems like personality disorders or psychosis. All right, now here's my question for the day. Is there any difference in how a therapist might go about helping a client in distance counseling as opposed to in-person counseling? Well, Jef said not really. There are more similarities than differences. In both cases, the idea is to understand where a client is coming from, to find out what the issue is, how did it start, and establish a partnership with the client to achieve a goal. So it's nice to know that a lot of the skills a therapist learns in traditional counseling, that they can be applied to distance counseling. Now, if you'd like the show notes for today's podcast episode, then please visit my website, chrisquarto.com. And if you like what you're hearing on these podcasts, then please consider Googling Make a Mental Note Podcast iTunes, and that'll get you to the iTunes site for this podcast. And write a short review and just kind of indicate how much you like this podcast. That'll really help me. Thanks as always for listening, and have a great rest of the day.